The letter from the Homeowners Association arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, and when I opened it, I genuinely thought someone was playing an elaborate prank on me. I stood there in my driveway in Bend, Oregon, staring at the formal notice that informed me I was being fined $500 for exceeding the community's firewood storage limit by 2.5 cords. The problem was, I had no idea such a limit even existed, and winter was coming fast in Central Oregon, where temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. My name is Nathan Reynolds, and I had moved into the Pine Ridge Estates community just 8 months earlier after landing a remote job with a tech company out of Portland. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first: quiet streets, well-maintained homes, and surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made Oregon famous. My 2-story craftsman-style house had a fireplace that I planned to use frequently during the harsh winter months, which was why I had ordered 4 cords of firewood back in September, when prices were still reasonable. I read through the letter 3 times, each reading making my blood pressure rise a little higher. According to the notice, signed by someone named Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, Pine Ridge Estates, had a strict policy limiting firewood storage to 1.5 cords per household. The letter claimed this limit was clearly stated in the Community Guidelines, Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph B. It went on to say that my excessive stockpiling was considered both a fire hazard and an eyesore that diminished property values for my neighbors. I walked around to my backyard where I had neatly stacked the firewood against the fence, covered with a tarp to keep it dry. The wood was organized, stable, and nowhere near any structures. I had specifically chosen that location because it was out of sight from the street and barely visible from my neighbors' properties. The whole setup looked professional because I had watched several YouTube videos on proper firewood stacking techniques. There was nothing hazardous or unsightly about it. Inside my house, I immediately started digging through the massive binder of HOA documents I had received at closing. My real estate agent had handed it to me with an apologetic smile, saying most of it was standard stuff that nobody really read. I had flipped through it briefly, but admittedly had not memorized every single rule. Now, as I searched through page after page of regulations covering everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the exact shade of beige allowed for exterior paint, I finally found Section 12. There it was, buried among rules about propane tank placement and regulations for decorative lawn ornaments. No household shall store more than 1.5 cords of firewood on their property at any given time. The rule seemed absurdly specific and impractical for a region where heating with wood was common and economical. 1.5 cords might get you through a mild winter if you barely used your fireplace, but for someone planning to use wood as a supplemental heat source throughout the cold months, it was nowhere near enough. I called the HOA office number listed on the letterhead. After 4 rings, a woman answered with a clipped, professional tone that immediately put me on edge. Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. This is Patricia speaking. How may I direct your call? Hi, Patricia. This is Nathan Reynolds from 847 Cascade Drive. I just received a letter about a fine for my firewood storage, and I was hoping we could discuss this. There was a brief pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on that particular quality I had come to associate with people who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power. Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I personally conducted the inspection of your property last week. You are currently in violation of our firewood storage ordinance. I understand that now, but I was not aware of this specific rule when I ordered the wood. Is there any way we could work out a grace period for me to use up the excess? Winter is coming, and I will naturally go through it. The rules are clearly stated in your community guidelines, which you signed acknowledgement of receiving at closing. Ignorance of the rules does not exempt you from following them. Her tone was becoming more condescending with each sentence. The fine stands, and you have 30 days to remove the excess firewood from your property or face additional penalties. I tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable. Patricia, I live alone in a 2,000-square-foot house. 4 cords of firewood is not excessive for someone who plans to use their fireplace regularly through winter. The wood is neatly stacked, properly covered, and not visible from the street. Mr. Reynolds, I do not make the rules. I simply enforce them. The board established the 1.5 cord limit after careful consideration of safety concerns and aesthetic standards. Your property was photographed during inspection, and the violations are well documented. You will need to comply or face escalating fines. Can I at least appeal this to the board, or attend a meeting to discuss it? You may submit a written appeal, which will be reviewed at the next board meeting on November 15th. However, I should inform you that in my 3 years as HOA president, the board has never overturned one of my violation notices. We take community standards very seriously here at Pine Ridge Estates. The call ended shortly after, leaving me frustrated and bewildered. Over the next few days, I talked to several of my neighbors about the situation. Most of them were sympathetic but unsurprised. A retired couple 3 houses down, the Mitchells, told me that Patricia Henderson had a reputation for strict enforcement, and that she seemed to take personal pleasure in finding violations. She once fined the Johnsons $200 because their lawn was half an inch taller than the maximum allowed height, Mrs. Mitchell said, shaking her head. She actually came out with a ruler and measured it in front of them. Most people around here just try to stay off her radar. I spent the next week crafting a detailed written appeal. I included photographs of my firewood storage, citations of Oregon building codes showing my setup met all safety requirements, and even testimonials from neighbors stating that my firewood pile did not negatively impact their property values or enjoyment of the neighborhood. I researched similar HOA communities in the area and found that most either had no firewood restrictions or allowed significantly more than 1.5 cords. I presented data showing that the average household in Central Oregon using wood heat regularly consumed between 3 to 5 cords per winter. The appeal letter was 10 pages long, professionally formatted, and I felt confident it made a strong case for at least a variance or an extension of the compliance deadline. I submitted it to the HOA office via certified mail, ensuring I had proof of delivery. 2 weeks later, I received a response, a single-page form letter stating that my appeal had been reviewed and denied. The letter was dated the same day they received my appeal, making it clear that nobody had actually given it serious consideration. The $500 fine remained in effect, and I now had just 2 weeks left to comply with the removal demand. I decided to attend the November 15th board meeting in person. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed the HOA office. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, about 20 other residents were already there, most looking as unhappy as I felt. Patricia Henderson sat at the front table with 4 other board members. She was exactly what I had imagined from our phone conversation. A woman in her early 50s with a severely professional haircut, wearing a blazer that looked like it had been pressed within the last hour. Her expression was one of barely concealed disdain as she surveyed the assembled residents. The meeting began with standard administrative business, all delivered in Patricia's clipped, authoritative tone. After about 30 minutes of discussing budget allocations and landscaping contracts, she opened the floor for homeowner concerns. I raised my hand immediately, and Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly when she recognized me. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, you may approach the microphone." I walked to the small podium set up for residents and addressed the board. "Thank you. I am here regarding the $500 fine I received for firewood storage. I submitted a detailed written appeal, but I was hoping to discuss this matter in person and perhaps find a reasonable compromise." "Your appeal was reviewed and denied, Mr. Reynolds. Is there something new you wish to add?" "Yes, actually. I have been researching the origin of this 1.5 cord limit, and I cannot find any documentation of when or why this specific restriction was implemented. I have also spoken with several neighbors who use their fireplaces regularly, and many of them were similarly unaware of this rule. Given that we live in a region where wood heating is common and practical, I am hoping the board might consider revising this particular regulation." Patricia shuffled some papers in front of her without really looking at them. "The rule was established 4 years ago during a comprehensive review of community safety standards. The limit was based on fire marshal recommendations. I actually spoke with the Bend Fire Department this week," I said, pulling out my phone to reference my notes. "According to Fire Inspector Mike Torres, there are no city or county regulations limiting residential firewood storage to 1.5 cords. He said that as long as wood is stored at least 30 feet from structures and properly stacked, there is no inherent fire hazard. My storage meets those requirements." A few other residents murmured in agreement, and I noticed several people nodding. Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Reynolds, the fire marshal recommendations I referenced were specific to our community and were provided during a consultation with the board. Those records are part of our internal documentation. Could I see those records?" As a homeowner, I should have access to the documentation supporting rules that result in $500 fines. Patricia exchanged glances with the other board members. "That documentation is maintained in our archives. You would need to submit a formal records request." "I would like to do that then. How do I formally request these records?" She provided me with a brief, bureaucratic explanation of the records request process, which seemed deliberately convoluted. Then she moved to dismiss my concern and call on the next homeowner, but I was not quite finished. "One more thing," I said. "The fine amount of $500 seems excessive for a first-time violation of a rule I was genuinely unaware of. Is there a standard fine schedule, or is this amount arbitrary?" "All fine amounts are established by the board and are outlined in the enforcement guidelines. Your violation was classified as a Category 3 safety concern, which carries a $500 fine. If you fail to remedy the situation within your compliance deadline, the fine will increase to $750, with additional penalties accruing at a rate of $100 per week thereafter." I thanked her through gritted teeth and returned to my seat, frustrated but not defeated. As the meeting continued, I noticed that several other residents had complaints about Patricia's enforcement practices. A woman named Deborah was being fined for having a garden gnome that exceeded the maximum allowed height for lawn decorations by 2 inches. A man named Robert had received a violation notice because his garage door was left open for more than 1 hour on a Saturday afternoon, apparently violating some obscure rule about maintaining curb appeal. The pattern was clear. Patricia Henderson was interpreting and enforcing every rule in the most strict, literal way possible, with no room for common sense or circumstance. What bothered me more than the fine itself was the apparent lack of oversight or checks on her authority. After the meeting, several residents approached me in the parking lot. Deborah, a woman in her 30s with paint-stained jeans and an exasperated expression, introduced herself properly and said what I was thinking. She is completely out of control. Half the neighborhood has been hit with these ridiculous fines. My garden gnome fine is $300. It is insane. Robert joined our conversation. He was a tall man in his 60s who spoke with a measured, careful tone. I have been documenting everything. The fines have increased dramatically since Patricia took over as president. Last year, the HOA collected about $12,000 in violation fees. This year, we are already over $40,000 and we still have 6 weeks left. Where is all that money going? I asked. Good question, Robert replied. The HOA budget is public record, but when I requested detailed financial reports last month, I got the same runaround you just experienced about records requests. It takes weeks to process, requires multiple forms, and then you get heavily redacted documents that do not tell you much. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to stay in touch. As I drove home that night, I felt both angry and determined. This was not just about my firewood anymore. It was about a system that seemed designed to harass residents and extract money, while providing no clear benefit or accountability. Over the next week, I filed a formal records request for both the fire marshal consultation documentation and the detailed financial reports for the past 2 years. I also did something I had not done in a long time. I started attending city council meetings in Bend to better understand local governance and regulations. At one of these meetings, I met Valerie Stevens, a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who spoke at the council meeting about proposed legislation for HOA oversight in Oregon. After the meeting, I approached her and explained my situation. 1.5 cords, she said, raising her eyebrows. That is unusually restrictive, even by HOA standards. Most communities do not regulate firewood at all unless it becomes a genuine hoarding situation. And the fine amount is definitely on the high end for a non-safety issue. Patricia claims it is a safety issue based on fire marshal recommendations, but I cannot get access to that documentation. Valerie pulled out a business card and handed it to me. Document everything. Every communication, every deadline, every fine notice. HOAs are supposed to operate transparently and in the best interest of the community. When they start operating like profit centers or personal fiefdoms, that is when you have grounds for legal action. I would be happy to review your case if you decide you need representation. I thanked her and kept her card, hoping I would not need it but glad to have the option. When I got home, I found another letter from the HOA in my mailbox. My compliance deadline was now just 1 week away, and the letter reminded me in bold, underlined text that failure to remove the excess firewood would result in escalated fines and possible legal action. That weekend, I made a decision. I called a friend who lived about 15 miles outside Bend in an area without HOA restrictions and asked if I could store some firewood on his property temporarily. He agreed, and I spent Saturday moving 2 cords of wood to his place, leaving me with exactly 1.5 cords in my backyard. It felt absurd to be hauling firewood around like contraband, but I needed to stop the bleeding before the fines got worse. On Monday, I called the HOA office and informed them that I had come into compliance with the firewood limit. Patricia sounded almost disappointed when she confirmed she would send someone to verify, and that I still owed the original $500 fine. The fine does not go away just because you eventually complied, Mr. Reynolds. It is a penalty for the violation itself. I understand. I will pay the fine under protest while I continue to pursue my records requests and explore other options. That is certainly your right, she said in a tone that suggested she had heard such threats before and was unimpressed. I paid the fine via check, writing paid under protest in the memo line, and continued my research. Over the next 3 weeks, I dove deep into HOA law in Oregon, reading statute after statute and learning about the various requirements for HOA governance, transparency, and resident rights. What I found was enlightening. Oregon law requires HOAs to maintain detailed financial records and make them available to homeowners within 10 business days of a written request. The law also requires HOAs to provide reasonable notice before implementing new rules and to ensure all enforcement actions are applied consistently across the community. There were provisions for dispute resolution and even penalties for HOAs that operated in bad faith. When my records request hit the 30-day mark without a response, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board citing the specific Oregon statute. They were violating and demanding compliance within 5 business days. I also sent copies of this letter to all 5 board members individually at their home addresses, which I obtained from public property records. That got a response. Patricia called me directly, her voice tight with irritation. "Mr. Reynolds, your aggressive approach to records requests is creating an administrative burden on our volunteer board. We are working on compiling the information you requested, but it takes time. Oregon law requires you to provide records within 10 business days. It has been over 30. I am not trying to be difficult, Patricia, but I have a right to see the documentation supporting a $500 fine. The documentation exists, I assure you. You will receive it. When, specifically, there was a long pause. By the end of this week. Thank you. I look forward to reviewing it." The documents arrived the following Friday, and they were interesting, to say the least. The financial records showed exactly what Robert had suspected, a dramatic increase in violation fines since Patricia took over as president. But more concerning was how vaguely the expenditure side of the ledger was documented. Large sums were listed simply as administrative costs, consulting fees, and legal expenses with no additional detail. The fire marshal consultation documentation was even more suspicious. It consisted of a single-page letter on Bend Fire Department letterhead, dated 4 years ago, providing general guidance about firewood storage. The letter mentioned keeping wood 30 feet from structures and ensuring proper ventilation if stored under cover. There was absolutely no mention of a 1.5 cord limit. In fact, the letter stated that quantities up to 10 cords were generally considered reasonable for residential use. I made copies of everything and scheduled a meeting with Valerie Stevens. When I showed her the documents, she studied them carefully, making notes on a legal pad. "This is fascinating," she said. "The fire marshal letter actually contradicts the rule your HOA implemented. They essentially cherry-picked general safety advice and then added their own arbitrary limit that has no basis in the consultation they claim to be following. Can they do that? Just make up rules and attribute them to sources that do not actually support the rules? Technically, HOAs can create rules within reason, but they have to be applied consistently and reasonably. The problem here is the misrepresentation. They are telling homeowners this limit is based on fire marshal recommendations when it clearly is not. That could be considered deceptive governance." Valerie leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her lips thoughtfully. "The financial records are concerning too. These administrative costs are unusually high. A community your size should not have annual administrative expenses over $60,000. Something does not add up. What should I do? First, I think you should request more detailed accounting records. Specifically, ask for vendor invoices, consultant contracts, and check registers showing who is actually receiving these payments. Under Oregon law, you are entitled to that level of detail. Second, I would recommend attending every board meeting from now on and encouraging other concerned homeowners to do the same. The more witnesses to these decisions, the better. I followed her advice. My next records request was even more specific, asking for copies of all checks written from HOA accounts, all consultant and vendor contracts, and detailed invoices supporting the administrative and legal expenses. I also created a simple one-page flyer explaining the situation and my concerns about the HOA's financial transparency. I printed 50 copies and spent a Saturday walking around the neighborhood, introducing myself to neighbors and sharing information. The response was overwhelming. Most people had their own HOA horror stories, and many were angry about fines they felt were unjust. We created an informal email group, and within a week, we had 35 households actively communicating about HOA concerns. Robert took the lead on organizing a petition demanding a special meeting to review the HOA's financial practices and enforcement policies. Patricia did not take this well. The next HOA board meeting, held in mid-December, had the biggest turnout in years. The small clubhouse was packed with angry residents, many clutching violation notices and fine demands. Patricia opened the meeting with a stern announcement. Before we begin tonight, I want to address the recent campaign of misinformation being spread by certain residents. The board operates with complete transparency within the bounds of our legal obligations. The recent records requests have been onerous and disruptive, and we believe they are being pursued in bad faith to harass the board and undermine the HOA's authority. I stood up from my seat in the back. Patricia, requesting financial records is not harassment. It is a legal right, and transparency should not be conditional or difficult. If the board is operating properly, providing documentation should be straightforward, not a burden. Several residents applauded, which clearly infuriated Patricia. Her face flushed red and she pointed at me. "Mr. Reynolds, you are out of order. You have not been recognized to speak." "Then I would like to be recognized." I move that we add to tonight's agenda a discussion of financial transparency and the development of more reasonable enforcement policies. "Seconded," called out Deborah from near the front. Patricia looked flustered, conferring quickly with the other board members in heated whispers. Finally, she turned back to the room. "The motion is noted, but the agenda is already full. This matter can be addressed at a future meeting." Robert stood up, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, according to our bylaws, any motion seconded by a homeowner in attendance must be put to a vote of present members. I have the bylaws right here if you would like to review them." The tension in the room was palpable. Patricia clearly had not expected organized resistance. After another whispered consultation with the board, she grudgingly agreed to put it to a vote. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only 2 dissenting voices. What followed was a 3-hour meeting that covered everything from questionable fine enforcement to concerning financial practices. Resident after resident stood up to share their experiences with aggressive enforcement and what felt like arbitrary rule interpretations. Several people pointed out that their fines seemed to be concentrated on homeowners who had previously questioned or disagreed with Patricia at meetings. One resident, A retired accountant named Gloria had done her own analysis of the financial reports. She presented a detailed breakdown showing that administrative expenses had increased by 320% over 3 years, while the actual services provided to the community had remained the same or decreased. She also noted that legal expenses were being charged to the HOA for defending the board's actions, which meant homeowners were essentially paying for the HOA to fight against homeowners. "Where is all this money actually going?" Gloria demanded. "We need to see detailed accounting, not vague category labels." Patricia defended the expenses as necessary for proper governance and enforcement. She claimed the legal fees were for consulting on complex issues, and that the administrative costs reflected the professional management of a growing community. But when pressed for specifics, she became evasive and defensive. The meeting ended with a commitment from the board to provide more detailed financial documentation at the next meeting and to review enforcement policies for potential reforms. It felt like a small victory, but I could tell from Patricia's expression that this was far from over. Over the Christmas holidays, I kept my nose relatively clean. I maintained my 1.5 cords of firewood, making periodic trips to my friend's property to retrieve more as I burned through my allowed stockpile. It was inefficient and annoying, but I did not want to give Patricia any excuse to come after me again. In early January, I received the detailed financial records I had requested. When I started going through them with Robert and Gloria, we immediately spotted problems. Multiple checks had been written to something called Henderson Consulting Services for amounts ranging from $500 to $2,000, occurring monthly for the past 18 months. We cross-referenced the name and discovered that Henderson Consulting Services was registered to Patricia's husband, Mark Henderson. This was potentially a major conflict of interest. Patricia was approving payments from HOA funds to a company owned by her spouse, and there was no documentation showing what services were actually being provided. The total amount paid to Henderson Consulting Services over 18 months was nearly $40,000. We also found checks to a law firm called Morrison and Associates for various legal consultations. When we contacted the firm to inquire about their work for the HOA, they were confused. After some checking, they confirmed they had never provided services to Pine Ridge Estates HOA. The checks, they told us, appeared to have been deposited, but they had no record of issuing invoices or doing any work. This was no longer just about bad HOA governance. This looked like potential fraud. Robert, Gloria, and I met with Valerie Stevens to review everything we had found. She examined the documents carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious as she worked through the paper trail. "This is significant," she said finally. "If Patricia has been directing HOA funds to her husband's company without proper authorization and disclosure, that is self-dealing and potentially embezzlement. If she has been writing checks to a law firm that never provided services, we need to figure out where that money actually went. These could be criminal matters, not just HOA disputes." "What should we do?" I asked. "First, we need to bring this to the full board's attention in a formal way. There are other board members who might not be aware of what Patricia is doing. If they are complicit, that is one thing, but if they have been trusting her to handle finances without oversight, they need to know. Second, we should probably notify the district attorney's office. Financial fraud involving community association funds is taken seriously." We scheduled another special meeting, this time specifically to address the financial irregularities we had discovered. We sent formal notice to all board members, all homeowners, and we also invited a representative from the Oregon Department of Justice that handles HOA complaints. The meeting was scheduled for January 28th. In the 2 weeks leading up to it, Patricia tried multiple tactics to prevent or delay it. She sent letters claiming the meeting was improperly noticed, that the allegations were defamatory, and that we were harassing the board. She even had the HOA attorney, a different lawyer than the Morrison firm we had investigated, send a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if we continued to spread false and damaging claims. Valerie responded to all of this with professional, legally sound letters pointing out that homeowners have every right to question financial practices and call meetings according to the bylaws. The meeting would proceed as scheduled. When the day arrived, the turnout was massive. The clubhouse could not hold everyone, so we moved the meeting to the community center in Bend proper, which had space for about 200 people. Local news had gotten wind of the situation, and there were 2 television crews outside. Patricia arrived with her husband Mark and the HOA attorney. She looked composed, but I could see the strain around her eyes. The other 4 board members looked nervous and uncomfortable, clearly aware that this meeting was not going to go well for anyone. I presented our findings methodically. I had prepared a presentation with copies of all the relevant checks, business registration documents, and correspondence with Morrison and Associates. I explained the timeline, the amounts, and the pattern of payments. Gloria backed me up with her financial analysis, showing that these questionable expenses accounted for most of the dramatic increase in HOA costs. The HOA attorney interrupted several times, claiming that internal financial matters were not appropriate for public discussion, and that we were violating confidentiality provisions. Valerie shut that down immediately, citing Oregon's public records laws and the specific provisions in HOA statutes that require transparency. When it was Patricia's turn to respond, she was defensive and combative. She claimed that Henderson Consulting Services provided legitimate administrative support services, including research, documentation, and community liaison work. When asked why there were no invoices or work product to document these services, she said that the nature of the work did not always produce tangible deliverables. Regarding the Morrison and Associates checks, she became more evasive, suggesting there might have been a bookkeeping error, or that perhaps the payments were for a different legal matter that the firm forgot about. It was not convincing. One of the other board members, a woman named Jennifer Clark, stood up and addressed Patricia directly. "Patricia, I have served on this board for 2 years, and you have always handled the finances. You told us everything was in order. Did you ever disclose that you were approving payments to your husband's company?" Patricia's face went pale. "I mentioned it in passing at a board meeting. It is in the minutes." "I just reviewed every set of board meeting minutes from the past 3 years, Jennifer said, holding up a stack of papers. "There is no mention of Henderson Consulting Services or any disclosure of your husband's involvement. Not once." The room erupted in angry voices. Homeowners were shouting questions and accusations. The representative from the Department of Justice was taking extensive notes. The news cameras were capturing everything. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was clear she had lost the room. After about 20 minutes of chaos, Jennifer made a motion for the board to immediately suspend Patricia from her position as president pending a full investigation. The motion was seconded and passed 4-1, with only Patricia voting against it. Over the following weeks, the situation escalated beyond just the HOA. The Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into the financial practices of Pine Ridge Estates, HOA. The police got involved when evidence suggested that the Morrison and Associates checks had been altered after being written, with Morrison and Associates written as the payee but actually deposited into accounts controlled by Patricia through a complex shell company structure. I cooperated fully with investigators, providing all the documentation and research I had compiled. So did Robert, Gloria, and about 20 other homeowners who had been actively involved in uncovering the problems. In late March, Patricia Henderson was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft by deception, forgery, and fraud. The total amount she had allegedly embezzled was estimated at over $75,000 across 3 years. Mark Henderson was also charged as an accomplice for his role in the Henderson Consulting Services scheme. The story made regional news, and several other HOAs in Oregon began reviewing their own financial practices after the scandal. Our HOA underwent a complete restructuring, with new board members elected and new oversight procedures implemented to prevent anything similar from happening again. The charges against me for the Firewood violation were officially dismissed, and the $500 I had paid in fines was refunded. The new board conducted a comprehensive review of all the community rules and found that many were either unreasonably restrictive or poorly justified. The firewood limit was increased to 5 cords, which was much more reasonable for the climate and common heating practices in the area. By April, I had moved my firewood back to my property, properly stacked and well within the new limits. I stood in my backyard one evening, looking at the neat rows of wood, and reflected on the bizarre journey that a simple firewood pile had sparked. I never intended to become an HOA watchdog or to uncover a fraud scheme. I just wanted to heat my house efficiently and affordably through the winter. But Patricia's aggressive enforcement and my refusal to just pay fines without questioning them had led to discovering serious problems that affected the entire community. The preliminary hearing for Patricia's criminal case was scheduled for June. The prosecutor told me I would likely need to testify about the document trail and the investigation process. I was prepared to do that, both for the sake of justice and to help ensure that other homeowners did not fall victim to similar schemes. In May, the new HOA board held a community meeting to discuss lessons learned and to implement new transparency measures. All financial records would now be posted online monthly. All contracts over $1,000 required competitive bids and full board approval with documented votes. Any board member with a potential conflict of interest on any issue had to recuse themselves, and a registry of board member business interests was created and made public. Jennifer Clark was elected as the new HOA president, and her first official act was to apologize to all the homeowners who had been unfairly fined under Patricia's regime. The HOA board voted to refund all violation fines from the previous 2 years, which amounted to over $30,000 being returned to residents. Many people, including Deborah with her garden gnome fine and Robert with his garage door violation, got their money back. The community felt different after everything that happened. People were more engaged, more watchful, and more willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. We had learned that HOA boards, like any organization with power and money, required active oversight and participation from the people they served. My friendship with Robert and Gloria deepened through the whole experience. We started having monthly coffee meetings at a local shop, often joined by other neighbors who had been part of the effort to expose the fraud. We joked that we had accidentally created a neighborhood watch program, except instead of watching for burglars, we were watching for HOA overreach. The trial eventually took place in September. Patricia Henderson was convicted on most counts and sentenced to 3 years in prison plus restitution. Mark Henderson received 18 months for his role. The judge was particularly harsh in sentencing, noting that Patricia had violated the trust of her community and abused her position of authority for personal gain. During her victim impact statement opportunity, Gloria spoke on behalf of the community. She talked about how HOAs are supposed to protect property values and enhance community living, not become tools for personal enrichment. She described the stress and financial burden that excessive fines had placed on families, including one elderly couple who had almost lost their home because they could not keep up with accumulating violation penalties on top of their regular HOA dues. I also spoke briefly, focusing on the importance of transparency and accountability. I mentioned that what started as frustration over a firewood fine became a lesson in civic engagement, and the need for residents to stay informed and active in community governance. After the trial concluded, life in Pine Ridge Estates slowly returned to normal, though with a heightened sense of community awareness. The new board operated efficiently and fairly. Violations were addressed with warnings and reasonable timelines for correction, rather than immediate large fines. The atmosphere shifted from one of anxiety about what rule might be enforced next to one of genuine community cooperation. I continued using my fireplace throughout the following winters, burning through several cords each season. Every time I carried wood from my backyard pile into the house, I remembered the absurdity of where it all began and felt grateful that we had pushed back rather than just accepting the unreasonable restrictions and questionable practices. The local media occasionally followed up on the story, especially when other HOA fraud cases emerged in different parts of Oregon. Our case became something of a cautionary tale and a template for homeowners dealing with similar issues. Valerie Stevens even presented at several legal conferences about HOA oversight and homeowner rights, using our experience as a case study. As autumn approached again, bringing the familiar chill of Central Oregon nights, I placed my annual firewood order. 4 cords, same as before, but this time with full confidence that it was well within the community guidelines and that nobody would be showing up with a citation and a $500 fine. The firewood was delivered on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 2 years after the original letter that started everything. The delivery driver, a friendly guy named Dave, stacked it neatly along my back fence just like last time. As I signed the delivery receipt, I mentioned casually that I was glad to not have to worry about HOA firewood police anymore. He laughed and said he had heard about what happened with our HOA. Apparently, the story had made the rounds among firewood suppliers in the region. "You are kind of famous in the firewood community," he said with a grin. "The guy who took down a corrupt HOA president over firewood rights." After he left, I walked around my property, appreciating the peaceful afternoon and the mountains visible in the distance. My house felt truly like my own now, not just a property I occupied subject to the arbitrary whims of whoever happened to be in charge of the Homeowners Association. The garden gnome that Deborah had been fined for was still in her yard, standing proudly at its full, technically excessive height. Robert's garage door was open on that particular Saturday afternoon as he worked on some project inside. Nobody was coming around with rulers and measuring tapes looking for violations. The community was being maintained and managed, but with common sense and reasonableness. I learned a lot through that experience, far beyond anything about firewood storage or HOA regulations. I learned that small injustices can reveal larger problems, that documentation and persistence matter, and that communities are stronger when residents stay engaged rather than passive. I learned that titles and positions do not make someone's authority absolute, and that asking questions is not the same as causing trouble. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes fighting back against something that seems small and petty is worth it, not just for yourself, but for everyone else who might be affected. If I had just paid that initial $500 fine and moved my firewood without questioning it, Patricia Henderson might still be in charge, still extracting money from residents, still running the HOA like her personal profit center. The whole ordeal made me a better neighbor and a more active community member. I now attended most HOA meetings, not because I expected problems, but because I understood the importance of residents staying informed and involved. I served on a couple of committees, helping to update community guidelines to make them more reasonable and clear. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, as winter settled in and I burned firewood from my fully legal 4-cord stockpile, I occasionally thought about how different things could have been. If I had been less stubborn, if Robert and Gloria had not been willing to help investigate, if other homeowners had not stood up when it mattered, the fraud might have continued for years, extracting more money and causing more stress. The fireplace crackled pleasantly on cold evenings, heating my living room and creating the cozy atmosphere I had envisioned when I first moved to Bend. Each piece of wood I burned felt like a small victory, a reminder that even in seemingly powerless situations, individuals can make a difference when they refuse to accept unreasonable treatment and work together with others who share their concerns. The community emerged stronger from the scandal, with better governance, more engaged residents, and a collective understanding that HOAs serve homeowners, not the other way around. Property values in Pine Ridge estates actually increased after the changes, as the neighborhood gained a reputation for being well-managed and fair, rather than oppressively strict. As I sat by my fireplace on a particularly cold January evening, watching snow fall outside my windows and feeling the warmth of my technically illegal, but now legal again, firewood supply, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just from the physical warmth, but from knowing that persistence and principle had prevailed over petty tyranny and corruption. The story of the firewood fine that exposed an HOA fraud scheme became part of local lore, a tale told at neighborhood gatherings and community events. New residents moving into Pine Ridge estates were often told the story as part of their informal welcome to the neighborhood, usually with the advice to stay involved and ask questions if something seems wrong. And whenever I stacked firewood in my backyard each autumn, I did so with a smile, remembering that sometimes the most mundane things can lead to extraordinary outcomes when you refuse to accept injustice, even over something as simple as how much firewood you are allowed to store on your own property.